Can a single individual be present in two locations at once? Is this some kind of supernatural phenomenon, or simply an illusion? These were the exact questions running through the mind of a police officer when he encountered a young woman named Sunny Khan. The Orange County residential complex received an alarming 911 call about a potential hostage situation in one of the apartments. The scenario was particularly dangerous as it unfolded midday when children might be playing outside. All the police knew was that two unknown men had burst into an apartment where two female students resided. One of the girls managed to hide in the bathroom and contact emergency services. A police officer, having just arrived at the scene, was sprinting across the parking lot towards the building when he noticed a blue Mustang parked there. In reality, there was nothing unusual about this. As he ran past the vehicle, the officer observed two people inside. A Korean woman was in the driver's seat, with a young man in the passenger seat. At that moment, a radio call came through requesting backup in apartment 676. The officer dashed past the Mustang, making a mental note of the Korean woman's appearance just in case. Black hair, fair skin, brown eyes. Who knows if this information would be useful later, but due to professional habit, he did it unconsciously. The woman called out that her name was Jeena Han. She said she lived in apartment 676, but the officer was already out of earshot. When this officer reached the correct floor, the emergency response team had already forced their way inside. A perpetrator was lying face down on the floor, while two victims, young women, were trying to remove tape remnants from their legs and hair with shaking hands. The students were in their early 20s, both originally from South Korea. The officer approached the women and was overcome by a strange sense of déjà vu. Black hair, fair skin, brown eyes. He asked for the woman's name, and she replied that she was Jeena Han. At that moment, the policeman's mind exploded. The whole situation seemed unreal to him. How could this happen, given his photographic memory? He distinctly remembered seeing this woman behind the wheel of the Mustang, and now she stood before him again, terrified. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. Is it possible for one person to be in two places simultaneously? One giving testimony as a victim, while the other sits next to the defense attorneys at the defendant's table. When one starts crying, the other also begins to sob. They're simply on the same emotional wavelength. What is this? A glitch in the universe? The answer to this question is quite straightforward. Before us are identical twins. One sister is in the courtroom as a victim, the other on the defendant's bench, accused of conspiracy to commit violence. One of the most unsettling psychological studies was conducted in the 1960s, when scientists debated the nature of twin upbringing, questioning what exactly influences their developmental characteristics, genetic traits passed down by parents, or if it's all a result of nurture. How do we explain that pairs of twins with identical genetic structures live completely different lives, or conversely, they fully mirror each other's fate? It's difficult to argue, as convincing evidence for either hypothesis is currently lacking. The essence of the experiment was to place twin infants in two different adoptive families and observe how they develop, whether their habits are similar, and how they behave without knowing that somewhere in the world there's an exact copy of them. This study is quite classified, as it's considered unethical. Many of the separated children felt that something was missing in their lives, but couldn't pinpoint what exactly. One involuntary participant in the study learned he had a twin brother, and when they met, they discovered they had essentially lived parallel lives. They both had identical eating habits, disliked condiments and sauces, believing they overpowered the taste of food. Both brothers were passionate about the same sport and even had the same jersey number. This study led to 2 voluntary deaths and ruined the lives of many people. It's very difficult to live knowing you're not whole. At least, that's how most separated twins felt. They couldn't explain this sensation themselves, which led to rather dark thoughts. Sunny and Jeena Han learned of each other's existence when they were about 5 years old. It turned out that two girls who were exact copies lived in the same city. Their parents were well aware of this because after their divorce, they had reached an agreement. 3-year-old Sunny would stay with her mother, while her sister Jeena would live with her father. After some time, Mr. Han met another woman and decided he wanted to start a proper family with her and have children. The man thought it best to return Jeena to her birth mother. At first, it seemed that reuniting was the best thing that could have happened to the girls. Sunny and Jeena were overjoyed to find each other, but life with their mother wasn't as safe. New men constantly appeared in the house, whose names the girls didn't even try to remember. Mrs. Han would sometimes lock her daughters in the house, leaving only a box of eggs in the fridge, and leave the apartment for days, forcing them to somehow survive together. During those times, they were each other's only emotional comfort and support, though it's unclear how this struggle for survival played out. At some point, Mrs. Han developed a gambling addiction and borrowed a lot of money. Her relationships with men in Korea also didn't work out. Her daughters Jeena and Sunny constantly argued, competed with each other, and in the evenings counted the number of bruises, scratches, and hair pulled out from their fights. The woman decided to leave South Korea and move to California. She resolved to leave everything behind, packed up their suitcases, grabbed the girls, and headed for a new life. Although in reality, this new life turned out to be much worse than the one they had in their homeland. They had no money, knew no one in California, didn't speak English, and spent most of their time just sitting at home, not knowing what to do. Mrs. Han began to show signs of mental health issues. When the girls turned 13, their mother decided to leave them with her sister, who lived with her husband in Orange County. She simply dropped them off at a house, introduced them to the owners, and drove away to live her own life. Very often, twins are willing to do anything for each other. Sometimes the opposite happens, when they're ready to do anything just to be better than their exact copy. This is exactly what happened with Sunny and Jeena. The girls studied in the same class, were top students, and yet strongly envied each other. They felt that one of them was praised more by teachers, loved more by their aunt, and in general, one got all the best, while the other had to settle for second place. They were competitors in all aspects of their lives, be it school grades, boys, friends, or physical attractiveness. Moreover, everything came much easier to Sunny. It was easier for her to make friends, easier to get the highest score on a test. But Jeena didn't lag behind. She spent more time preparing for lessons, just to prevent Sunny from surpassing her. And she did everything to outdo her sister. The only thing where she had no chance was becoming Mom's favorite. For some reason, Mrs. Han always loved Sunny more, and on those rare occasions when she visited her daughters, she spent more time with her. The 21-year-old Jeena, after graduating high school with excellent results, enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. After spending some time among military personnel, she realized she didn't want to dedicate her life to it. The Army's demands were too much for her. Trainees had to perform intense physical training 6 days a week, run over 2 kilometers, do 33 push-ups and 42 squats in less than 12 minutes. This only seems easy at first glance, but for unprepared individuals, such physical exertion caused a burdensome feeling of regret about choosing military service. Additionally, there was military training, combat lessons, field preparation, and academic classes. Every second of a soldier's day is planned. If you're defending the nation's freedom, the concept of personal freedom simply doesn't exist. Jeena approached a senior officer at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas and declared her non-traditional orientation. This was her last resort to avoid military service after signing the contract. She had previously tried other methods. She told command that her father was ill, but they didn't care. When joining the Air Force, one must sign a contract for at least 2 years, sometimes 4 or 6 years. From that moment, a person gives their life to the government and can be discharged honorably or dishonorably. Technically, one could flee, but then they'd be found and forced to face a military court. Jeena tried another method, but they requested medical records of Mr. Han's health condition, so openly declaring her orientation was the last chance to leave the military base, as it was incompatible with military service. And Jeena, having nothing to do with people of different orientations, lied to be discharged from the Air Force. Finally left to her own devices, the young woman tried to find work to secure a comfortable existence. She got a job at a casino with a salary of about $20,000 a year, but this was just the base pay. Most of the money came in the form of tips. To increase her savings, Jeena decided to try her luck and gamble at the casino after work. She needed to occupy herself for an hour and a half until her colleagues were free. The girl approached the blackjack table and placed a bet. She didn't even notice how she lost everything she'd earned that day. The next day, barely finishing her shift, Jeena decided to win it back. After all, it can't be that you always lose. Her gambling addiction developed rapidly. Every morning she ran to the ATM to withdraw the cash she had in her savings account and place a bet in the evening. In the end, her losses exceeded what she earned. Jeena didn't realize she was repeating the fate of her own mother. While Mom's favorite Sunny received a scholarship to Lever University, graduated college, and now lived one of those irritatingly perfect lives people love to boast about on social media. She had a cute little apartment in a complex with a pool and gym included in the rent. She drove around in a white BMW, wore designer clothes, dated a guy, and enjoyed life surrounded by friends. At least that's what Jeena imagined as she looked at her sister's photos on social media. Did Sunny ever think about her twin sister? Their paths diverged right after high school. They hardly talked to each other and never called because Sunny was too busy creating her perfect life. This was a very painful contrast to Jeena's life, who by this time had ended up behind bars several times for theft. The girl was in debt, having become addicted to gambling, and felt inferior to her sister. 5 minutes can change your whole life. That's what Jeena thought. If she had been born 5 minutes earlier like Sunny, her fate would have been different. And now, it wouldn't be her, but her sister looking at social media photos and envying a perfect life. It was because of these 5 minutes that Mom always loved Sunny more, because in Korea, there's a hierarchy. Those who are older always get more respect, even if it's just 5 minutes. From the outside, such thoughts certainly seemed absurd, but Jeena seriously considered her sister guilty of all her misfortunes. They had the same genetics, the same appearance between them. So why should her exact copy get to live and be happy, while Jeena sat and watched? The only difference was in name, everything else matched. So technically, she had a right to that life. All she had to do was become Sunny Han. 19-year-old Helen was lounging on the sofa in the apartment she shared with her roommate. The doorbell was ringing, but she didn't want to let anyone in. The girl had already decided to pretend no one was home, as her roommate was in the shower, and she herself didn't wish to see anyone, but curiosity got the better of her. Helen approached the front door and peered through the glass panel to see a teenager selling magazines. He had already visited them a couple of hours earlier, but apparently had forgotten something. The girl opened the door slightly to inform him of this, and only then noticed a second guy standing off to the side. Helen said they didn't need anything and was about to slam the door shut when the magazines flew to the floor and both teenagers lunged forward into the apartment, shoving the girl inside. Helen began to scream and tried to run into the adjacent room, but they caught up and knocked her to the ground. She felt the cold metal against her left temple and a heavy, strong body pinning her down. A gun was pressed to her head, and she was ordered to be quiet. While Helen was being tied up, she was convinced to keep her mouth shut, promising that everything would be okay, and she no longer had the ability to scream anyway, as her mouth was sealed with a long strip of duct tape. The bound girl heard what the teenagers were talking about. At first, she thought it was a burglary, then decided they were going to assault her. But it turned out the perpetrators were looking for someone. She caught a phrase about how she was supposed to be home alone. Only then did Helen realize that the intruders weren't interested in her, but in her roommate. Meanwhile, the other girl came out of the shower and heard Helen's screams. She quickly pulled on some clothes and pressed her ear to the door. Instead of her roommate, she heard two male voices in the other room. The student grabbed her phone from the bed, darted back into the bathroom, and barricaded the door. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911 and reported the attack to the dispatcher. As soon as she hung up, the door burst open from a powerful blow. The young men dragged her out of the bathroom and began to tie her up. Helen took advantage of the moment when no one was looking at her and tried to escape. However, the guys were quicker. One of them rushed to cut her off and blocked her path to the exit. At first, both girls were laid face down on the bed. Then, apparently changing their minds, they were dragged into the bathroom. The roommates sat side by side, shaking with fear. They thought they were about to be killed, and to avoid blood splattering the bed, they were specifically brought to the bathroom. Meanwhile, one of the guys turned to the other and said they needed to go down to Jeena and tell her that Sunny was in their hands. However, her roommate was with her too. But this couldn't possibly happen, because at that very moment, Jeena Han was supposed to be in prison. How could she organize an attack on her twin sister? The Han parents indeed noticed some peculiar behaviors in their children when they were young. They weren't aware of the concept known as twin reaction. Even when separated, if one girl fell ill, the other would also feel unwell. This unique bond between twins can sometimes manifest in rather dark and twisted ways. Certain psychologists assert that twins occasionally experience intense anger and resentment towards each other. The childhood separation of Sunny and Jeena was traumatic for them. When one twin begins to hate the other, the underlying cause of aggression might be a hidden hatred and desire to harm, as if harming oneself. They completely identify with their sibling. After leaving the army, Jeena struggled to find her place in life. Working at a casino only led her to gamble away all her money and accumulate enormous debts. Jeena lost $40,000 borrowed from relatives and friends. This was accompanied by prolonged drinking binges. Once, she stole a large sum from her uncle, which landed her in jail. She was sentenced to 10 days in prison and 3 years of probation. Upon release, Jeena turned to her sister for help. Sunny offered to let her stay with her. For a while, the twins reunited and even managed to find common ground. But the truce didn't last long. The sisters began to quarrel, and it often ended in physical fights. After another argument, Sunny threatened to kick her sister out. Jeena panicked because she had nowhere else to go. She rummaged through her sister's belongings, found her credit cards, took the passport in Sunny Han's name, and stole her car keys, promptly landing herself back in jail because her twin sister filed a police report. Jeena was arrested for theft and sentenced to 6 months in prison. While incarcerated in San Diego, Jeena was allowed to leave the facility for a few hours each day. She used this opportunity to escape and seek revenge on her sister. She was tired of always being in the shadow of cheerful Sunny. Since Jeena lacked serious connections and hiring a hitman required money, she turned to those she could easily persuade to commit a crime. The 16-year-old Archie Bryant and 15-year-old John Syrett readily agreed to retrieve items from Sunny's apartment, where she lived with her roommate Helen. When Jeena told the boys she wanted to deal with her twin and promised them $100 each, they didn't think long. They bought tape and rope in advance and somehow obtained a gun. However, once alone with the captive girls, they noticeably faltered. Jeena waited outside in a rented Mustang in the residential complex's parking lot. John Syrett went downstairs. sat in the passenger seat to recount what happened. He was displeased that Sunny wasn't home alone. Jeena had clearly forgotten to warn the teenagers about this. At that very moment, police appeared in the residential complex's courtyard. It was the second day of Sunny testifying against her twin sister Jeena Han for conspiracy to harm. When the girl took the stand, she was completely disoriented, spoke incoherently, and looked unpresentable. She wore no makeup, and instead of regular clothes, she had on something like pajamas. The entire courtroom stared at her, unable to comprehend what had happened. Sunny explained that yesterday she had a big fight with her mom, then argued with her boyfriend, and they broke up. Sunny was so angry and upset that she wanted to end her life. So she went to the pharmacy and bought 3 packs of sleeping pills. The girl took the pills and washed them down with beer until she lost consciousness. She was taken directly from the courtroom to the hospital. She couldn't even descend from the podium on her own. If twin reaction requires them to feel each other's pain, then Jeena should have experienced severe distress when Sunny was recovering in intensive care during the trial. However, the Han twin sisters might have differed from most. When one was doing well, the other had to be doing poorly. When one thrived, the other had to sacrifice something. It seems they couldn't be happy and successful simultaneously. Mrs. Han, the twins' mother, remembered her parental duties during the trial. She couldn't even imagine what her daughter was going through at that moment. The woman helped Jeena recover emotionally and morally. She cared for her and supported her in every way. Then she regularly visited her daughter in prison. As for Sunny, Mrs. Han no longer speaks to her. She has a new favorite. During the trial, the public was divided into 3 groups. One group considered Jeena the evil twin and Sunny the good one. Another group supported Jeena and blamed everything on difficult life circumstances. And the third thought both twins were quite strange. The wildest part is that even when Jeena was arrested for conspiracy to harm, she used Sunny's name. The police asked her name and Jeena said she was Sunny Han. She was slowly stealing her twin sister's identity before she could take her life. A spectacle arose in court when both girls introduced themselves as Sunny Han. They couldn't even be distinguished by DNA test, because everything about them was identical. Sunny's past aroused great public interest. It seemed that while one sister constantly got into trouble, breaking the law, developing a gambling addiction, and lying to avoid military service, the other studied at Lever University on a full scholarship. She lived in a nice apartment in Irvine, drove her white BMW, and was law-abiding, the good and bad twins. But then the public learned that Sunny actually had her own crazy criminal history. Sunny and Jeena lived parallel lives. After successfully finishing school, their paths diverged, and the sisters moved apart. Jeena signed a military contract, while Sunny enrolled at Lever University, but ultimately dropped out. In school, when the sisters competed, Sunny was quite competitive, but after parting with Jeena, she lost motivation to study. The only thing that concerned her now was keeping up with the young people of Orange County, many of whom were wealthy. University tuition was $55,000 a year, plus food, housing rent, transportation, and all personal expenses. Sunny's classmates drove nice cars, with their parents paying the rent for them. No matter how hard the student tried to earn money to look no worse than others, it was an impossible burden for her. Part-time jobs didn't bring in much money, and she couldn't get a high-paying position due to lack of time, experience, and education. Whatever Sunny did, she couldn't afford to live like her classmates. At first, the girl started disappearing on weekends. Her friends thought Sunny had a new boyfriend, but then discovered she was working as a dancer in a bar in a neighboring town. Sunny couldn't accept the idea that she was worse than other students, and eventually became so engrossed in this that she lost her scholarship, dropped out of university, and from that moment, everything went downhill. She was arrested after stealing her friend's credit card and going shopping, buying designer lingerie, shoes, and sunglasses. Sunny spent several $1,000s and upon arrest insisted to the police that her friend had given her the card. Jeena had the same attitude every time she was arrested, so Jeena felt worse than Sunny, and Sunny felt worse than everyone else. They both didn't know the difference between wants and needs, and their desires simply spiraled out of control. Although the twins were formally separated after school, they continued to live parallel lives, committing very similar crimes. The Korean-American community rallied together and sent a letter to the judge requesting leniency for Jeena. They claimed that fights between siblings were part of Korean culture, and this had been exaggerated and dramatized by American police. Naturally, in Korea, it's not accepted for one sister to attempt to take the life of another, or even for brothers to hit each other in the face. But the Korean community actively wanted to support Jeena. Most surprisingly, over time, Sunny began to support her sister as well. Sunny's first day of testimony was consistent. She testified against Jeena as the key witness, but midway through the process, the girl began to change her story, or at least her attitude toward the crime. Sunny told the court she didn't believe her sister intended to take her life. Jeena herself explained her behavior by saying she just wanted to retrieve things from the apartment, claiming her sister wasn't answering calls and didn't want Jeena to come. They were arguing, so one decided to teach the other a lesson by sending two guys to tie up the owner and scare her a little. Jeena herself was surprised why the teenagers pulled out a gun. When Sunny was asked how she now felt about her sister, she replied that she wanted to do everything possible to help her. The two guys who staged the apartment takeover are the most mysterious part of this case. They were fully confident in the operation's success. Archie was in charge because he had the gun. He ordered John to go get Jeena, who was waiting in the car. While one teenager ran off, the other decided to help himself to something valuable. He began rummaging through the girl's things and grabbed a pager and a small amount of cash. When John reached the Mustang in the parking lot, he and Jeena saw police arrive at the house. A police officer running past them received a radio call, and Jeena heard her sister's apartment number. She shouted to the officer that it was her, Sunny, and that she lived in apartment 676. But he didn't hear her anymore. Archie was still in the student's apartment and had no idea the police had arrived until there was a knock at the door. The teenager, sure it was John and Jeena returning, turned the lock. He found himself face to face with 4 officers holding guns at the ready. After a moment of confusion, the teenager slammed the door, rushed to the emergency exit, and fell right into the hands of law enforcement waiting for him there, while Jeena and John simply vanished. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. The girl had no intention of returning to prison. On the way, they stopped at a bank and managed to withdraw $5,000 from Sunny's account. Then the accomplices headed to a car dealership to buy a $40,000 Nissan. Jeena's initial plan was to drive to Mexico, buy a plane ticket, fly to South Korea, and start life anew. However, her plan began to crumble at the point of purchasing the new car. When filling out the credit application, she answered questions as Sunny. Then she'd forget and start answering about herself, cross everything out, and write anew. The dealership salespeople immediately questioned how one could forget standard things about oneself. The dealership told Jeena they needed to wait until tomorrow. But Jeena didn't have time for that. She well understood that the police were now looking for them. So Jeena and John headed to a car rental agency, returned the blue Mustang, and tried to rent a new car. They were sitting on a couch at the rental agency when they were arrested. 2 factors made this arrest quite difficult. First, Jeena kept insisting she was Sunny Han. Second, Archie and John were minors. Archie was 16 and John was only 15. Jeena was 23 at the time, and they had met just 2 weeks before the attempted attack. Jeena Han was in prison. She had several months left of her sentence after stealing a total of about $40,000 from her uncle, the man who raised these girls and gave them the love and care they could give to parents. Jeena's cellmate said she behaved very strangely. She talked incessantly about how she couldn't stand her twin sister and wanted to see her dead. Jeena was only interested in Sunny, her gold jewelry, and money as a means to go to South Korea and start a new life. Since Jeena was sentenced to only 6 months, she was allowed to leave the correctional facility for 5 hours a day for work and then return. This was done so that former inmates could easily integrate into society after their release, and Jeena used these 5 hours to escape and attempt to send Sunny to the afterlife. She realized she would be sought for escape, so she decided to steal her law-abiding sister's identity. The fugitive hitchhiked and headed to California. She had nowhere to stay and no opportunity to get a job, so Jeena ended up in a shelter where she met 16-year-old Archie. The boy's parents suffered from addiction and didn't care for their son at all, so he had to make his own way in life. He practically grew up on the street. The only person supporting him was his best friend, an American named Jonathan Sirat. They were like brothers and trusted only each other. Archie was intrigued by the adult Asian woman who arrived in a blue Mustang. There was an air of mystery around her. The young people talked, and one day Jeena suggested they drive to Irvine to retrieve things from her sister. The girl motivated the teenagers with money, promising to give each one $100 if they could help her. On the way, they stopped at a store and bought everything necessary, as well as a stack of magazines to use as a ruse. When Jeena stated that they needed not just to retrieve things, but also to take her sister's life, the boys were noticeably frightened. They weren't prepared for such a turn of events, but were afraid to argue with Jeena, considering her insane at that moment. Meanwhile, the girl talked through each part of her plan, explaining in detail what the teenagers should do. The only thing she didn't anticipate was that Sunny wouldn't be alone in the apartment. Between themselves, the boys decided they would retrieve the things, and Jeena could deal with her sister on her own. But their plan didn't work the first time. Sunny opened the door, saw the boys with magazines, and quickly slammed it shut, shouting that they didn't need anything. Then Jeena insisted they try again, and as soon as the lock opened, to force their way inside. Later, Sunny and Helen reported that the boys, especially Archie who had the gun, were visibly shaking. He looked so scared that at first, the roommates thought he was under the influence of some drugs. In reality, the teenagers were simply afraid. They had never broken into someone's home or taken hostages before. Archie subsequently refused to plea bargain in court, based on the fact that he didn't intend to take anyone's life. The court assigned Jeena a psychologist, and she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder with antisocial traits. The girl emphasized that her mother was neglectful and cruel, and she had always been afraid of her, claiming this was the cause of all her psychological trauma. Mrs. Han believed her daughter and recognized her mistakes, so she did everything to make Jeena feel her care during the trial. The woman stated that she doesn't divide her daughters into good and bad twins. She loves them equally, and if she had the opportunity to raise her girls in a more stable family environment, the situation wouldn't have spiraled out of control. In the end, in May 1998, Jeena Han was found guilty of conspiracy to attempt murder and sentenced to 26 years in prison. Archie Bryant was sentenced to 14 years in prison as a minor, but was later released on parole. 15-year-old John Sirat received 8 years, but ultimately served 4 because he didn't threaten the girls with a gun, but simply broke into someone else's home. In prison, Jeena earned an associate's degree in social and behavioral studies. Sunny visited her in prison and left with tears in her eyes because she felt sorry for her sister. The girl told reporters that it was she, Sunny, who envied Jeena because she was much smarter. Sunny gained some fame for a while, often being invited to various shows to share her story, but then interest in her sharply declined. Jeena Han was released on parole after 20 years in 2017. Once free, she continued close communication with her mother. Now the former inmate is working towards an engineering degree and building a stable career, She takes care of her elderly mother, who still suffers from alcoholism and gambling addiction. Mrs. Han completely forgot she had 2 daughters. When asked about Sunny, the woman stated that she might no longer be alive. In reality, as soon as Jeena's life began to improve, Sunny was arrested for providing intimate services, thus confirming the theory that both twins couldn't be happy simultaneously. Why did the closest people to each other, such as twin sisters Jeena and Sunny Han, become practically enemies? What served as the starting point for their mutual hatred? Nature or nurture? We can only speculate about this. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.